So welcome back, everyone, and welcome particularly to Alan's mum and dad visiting from Scotland. I hope you won't find this too boring. You can always nod off if it's a bit confusing. So we are beginning a new series. We're going to be looking at the White Lotus Sutra, and in particular, over the next, I think, 3 weeks, we're going to be looking at the parable of the burning house, which many of you may well be familiar with. It's quite a well-known parable. But in a way, what we're going to be listening to, or what we need to kind of get ourselves into the context of, is that this, in a way, is a different voice of the Buddha. It's a different voice from the voice that we are used to hearing. All voices of the Buddha are about leading us from our unenlightened state to the state of enlightenment, which he had achieved. So in that respect, it's exactly the same, but it's a completely different tone, as it were, in this parable. So just to put some sort of context around that, this is one of the great works of Mahayana Buddhism. So there are sort of three, well, there was the original and then two greater developments of Buddhism over a period of about 500 to 1,000 years. And the Mahayana was the first of these great developments after the death of the Buddha himself. So for a period of about 500 years, there was an oral tradition, which we could think of as original Buddhism or old Buddhism or something. But then there was this kind of discussion or realization that what people had been tending to do was to learn and understand as best they could the original teachings of the Buddha, in order to reach enlightenment. And you think, well, of course, that's fine. Surely that's at some level what we're all doing. And at some level, that's absolutely true. That is what we're all doing. But the Mahayana Buddhists kind of looked back and saw that there wasn't just the teaching of the Four Noble Truths or the Noble Eightfold Path or the Four Foundations of Mindfulness or all the different lists that we often talk about in these evenings. I was thinking about it. It might just be because lists break down easily into, well, we'll do one each and it will last 6 weeks and then we'll do another set of another list. That we perhaps overemphasize the kind of early Buddhism, the kind of the lists, and Buddhism can feel like that's what it is. But actually what the Mahayana Buddhists realized was that we had all these lists, great as they are, but we also had the life of the Buddha, the example of the man, and what he did with his experience of enlightenment. And what he did was just work tirelessly to pass that experience on to others, to encourage others to share that experience that he had had. He worked non-stop from the point of his experience to share that with others. And he taught all of these different lists that we perhaps overemphasize were different ways that the Buddha tried desperately to explain his experience to others who didn't share that experience yet. And they thought, well, Buddhism is more than learning the lists. We have to learn also from the example of the life of the Buddha and the effort that he put in to passing that experience on to others. So there was a kind of realization that at some level, people had been trying to reach the state of enlightenment at some level for themselves. But that's not what the Buddha did. The Buddha did that and then tried to pass it on. So the Mahayanas felt that there should be a great emphasis on reaching the state of enlightenment on behalf of and for all others. So where you could say early Buddhism emphasized wisdom, but didn't have an awful lot to say, not strictly true, but for the sake of argument, didn't say a huge amount about compassion for others. Mahayana Buddhists felt that actually compassion for others was as important as the wisdom teachings that the Buddha passed on. So you could say, or you could think that the teachings that the Buddha left behind represented his wisdom. The life that the Buddha led and what he did with his life represented his compassion. And Mahayana Buddhists kind of equalized, as it were, the importance of both wisdom and compassion. And it is from that background that this sutra emerges, from the Mahayana background. So also it's worth saying that this and a lot of Mahayana teachings, they kind of appeal to the heart almost as much or even more so than the head. So earlier Buddhism was an oral tradition, lists were easy to memorize. Mahayana, being several hundred years later, didn't have the necessity for that oral memory tradition because writing was available at this point. So they have written a lot of sutras and a lot of their works that appeal to the heart, to kind of get into the center of our center of compassion, more than trying to kind of, as it were, get there via the head. So we look for heart responses to Mahayana texts. So they appeal to the imagination, not just the intellect. So what we'll be doing, as I said, is we'll be looking at the parable of the burning house over the next few weeks, and we'll be drawing out the symbolism and what we may learn from these symbols from what is otherwise a very simple, straightforward story, very simple, straightforward parable. And as we do that, it's worth realizing also that in a way, there's no right or wrong response. It's not like the Noble Eightfold Path, where you can think, you can remember 6 of them and then think, oh, maybe one of it's like right emailing or something. That's not actually part of the original Noble Eightfold Path. So there's a kind of a sense of right and wrong when we think about the earlier Buddhism and the lists, and we can feel that we've let ourselves down or whatever if we can only remember 7. I should probably do very well if you can remember 7. It's not like that with Mahayana texts. It's not like that with these parables. In a way, your response is your response, and that's fine. That's right. You have to be open to other people having a different response. That's their response, and that's right for them. And the other thing that's important to realize that as you progress and as you practice, your responses will change. As you grow and develop and change, so might your responses to these parables. So they're worth revisiting over time. We have visited them several times here at the Buddhist Centre. And if any of you, not sure, I can't quite remember who was all there, this parable or this sutra was the theme of the Sangha retreat that we had last December, just before Christmas. It's where we spent the weekend kind of exploring. We spent the weekend exploring it and just taking it deeper and deeper. And you can do that again and again and again. It's not a problem because your responses will evolve and change as you do. And in a way, what these parables do is they paint a picture. They paint a picture in our heads to which we have a heart response. And excuse me, in that picture, we may see ourselves more clearly in a way that's much harder to see without that picture being painted or being created. Or we may in that picture see the world in a different or clearer way than we have in any other way. There's something about painting the picture can speak to us in ways that otherwise would be very, very difficult. We can see ourselves more differently or more clearly. We can see the world differently or more clearly. We may also have some sort of reactions to some of these symbols and pictures that are being painted. And that again is quite informative. It's informative to see, well, why am I reacting to that? Nobody else seems to be reacting to that. What has it touched in me that is causing this reaction? What don't I like? What does that kind of aversion point to in me? Again, even a reaction can be informative as to how we are. And it's one of the great values of these parables is that they speak to us quite directly in a way that almost sort of bypasses the intellect. So does that make sense to everyone? Yeah, any questions so far? Great. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to read the sutra. It's not very long, so it won't take long. So I'm just going to read it. So it will be revisited each week as people unpack different aspects of it. So I'm going to read it. So you have the whole thing, and then I'll try and unpack a little bit, one sort of set of symbols within there. And then you'll have the chance towards the end to kind of talk about it amongst yourselves. And then, time permitting, there'll just be an open session of questions at the end. So I shall get my best reading voice on and just read this to you. So the parable of the burning house. Once upon a time, there was a great elder, a very rich old man who lived in a huge mansion with his hundreds of servants and his many children. The story does not speak of wives or mothers, but we know that the elder had as many as 30 children, and they were all quite young. The house in which they lived had once been magnificent, but now it was old and tumble down. The pillars were decaying, the windows were broken, the floorboards were rotting, and the walls were crumbling. And in the nooks and crannies of this tumble-down house there lurked all sorts of ghosts and evil spirits. One day the house suddenly caught fire. Because it was so old and the timbers were so dry, the whole building was burning merrily in no time. As it happened, the elder was safe outside the house when the fire started, but his children were playing inside. Too young to realise that they were in danger of being burnt to death, they just carried on playing and made no effort to escape. The elder was very afraid for his children, of course, and wondered how on earth to save them. At first, he thought of carrying them out of the house one by one, for he was strong and able, but he soon realised that it would be impossible to get them all out in time. Instead, he decided to try calling out to the children. He shouted, "The house is on fire. You're in terrible danger. Come out quickly." But the children had no idea what their father could mean by danger. They just carried on playing their games, glancing at the elder occasionally as he ran to and fro, but taking no serious notice of him at all. The elder saw that there was no time to lose, for the house would crash to the ground at any minute. In desperation, he hit upon another plan. He would try to trick the children into coming out of the house. Knowing the different nature of each child, he knew that they liked different kinds of toys, some liking one kind and some preferring another. So he called out to them, "Come and look at the toys I have brought for you. There are all kinds of carts, some drawn by deer, some drawn by goats, and some drawn by bullocks. And they are all standing just outside the gate. Come quickly and look." And although the children had been deaf to all his warnings, this time they heard him. They all came rushing and tumbling helter-skelter out of the burning house, pushing and shoving each other in their eagerness to get the new toys. When the elder was sure that all the children were safely out of the house, he sat down with a great sigh of relief. And at once, of course, the children came clamouring round him, demanding the toys he had promised them. The elder was extremely fond of his children and wanted to give them whatever their hearts desired. Unfortunately, he was extremely wealthy. In fact, his wealth was infinite. So he could afford to give them the best of everything. Instead of the carts of different kinds which he had promised them, therefore, he gave to each of them a magnificent bullock-drawn cart, bigger and better than they could have imagined in their wildest dreams. Although he had promised them one thing and given them something else, this was not deceitfulness on his part, because it was motivated by his desire for the welfare and the safety of his children. So that was the parable of the burning house. Is anyone just hearing that for the first time? Yes, yeah, great. Oh, great. Fantastic. Sorry?
It's not the one I thought it was.
Ah, okay. So it's nearly finished. So you can see that there are lots of images and symbols there. So there's the elders, obviously the Buddha, the children, us, the burning house, sense of urgency, danger, the toys, receiving something greater than was expected. The children not heeding warnings, but being drawn out by an interest in the carts. When Amarachandra tells this story, she thinks bullock carts are a bit boring and everybody would want a donkey cart. So she talks about donkey cart. So there are lots of things in there that we can draw out. What does that symbolism mean for us? So this week is what we're going to be doing over the next few weeks. So this week, I wanted to just kind of start near the beginning, where we were talking about the old tumble-down mansion. And what's the tumble down mansion with the ghosts and evil spirits and the nooks and crannies, and what that might say to us, what that might mean for our lives. So one question that crops up for you to just maintain in your mind is, why was it old and damaged? What was the significance of it being old and damaged? Why was it not some shiny marble Marbella seaside villa type mansion? Why was it described as being old and decaying? And all the ghosts in the nooks and crannies. What might the ghosts in the nooks and crannies represent? What kind of response do we have to that, and how does that fit with the tumble down, rotting mansion? So the way when we come to kind of look at these sorts of symbols, or think about these sorts of symbols, or reflect on these sorts of symbols, as I say, there's no particular right or wrong answer. Our own responses are our responses. But I can kind of share some of my responses, and share a kind of approach to kind of trying to understand more deeply what is being said in Mahayana sutras. So from that particular perspective, I always think that there's sort of two ways, as it were, of looking at it. One is a kind of worldly, and one is our own minds. Of course, from a Buddhist perspective, they are in fact almost one and the same thing, in as much as if we look at the first verses of the Dhammapada, our mind creates the world that we live in. But for the purposes of a Mahayana sutra, we could think, well, he might be talking about the world we inhabit, the world we live in. Or we could think about it as being, well, actually, this is representative of my mind. But one thing to always bear in mind with these things is whatever way you want to look at it, or whatever way we choose to try and understand what's being said, these sutras are the enlightened mind talking to an unenlightened mind. So these perspectives that are being conveyed are those of an enlightened mind to our minds, which are unenlightened. And it's important to remember that actually there are things that we may feel completely closed from, and actually that closeness could cause some reactions to some of the symbolism, and that's fine. It's understandable and it's fine. And if we recognize that and we accept that, then actually we've taken a step towards being a bit more open, being a bit less closed to ideas, being a bit more open to new things. And that in itself is a very positive step forward. So I think the easiest way to kind of start to think about it is to just think of the symbolism of the house being on fire. So that seems quite a straightforward one. So if we think about the symbolism of the house being on fire from a kind of worldly perspective, if you like, then of course we have the climate emergency. It makes sense that this symbolizes the climate emergency. If, however, we think about that as being our own minds rather than the world we inhabit, then what is on fire? What is it that's on fire? Well, that bit for me, and it's entirely up to each of us to make up our own minds. But for me, that reminds me of the first three of the four sights of the Buddha during his life. So during the Buddha's life, to remind everyone, there were four sights when he left the palace, which were old age, sickness, death, and then a wandering monk. And it was the human predicament of old age, sickness, and death, which really brought up a question for the young Buddha to be. I mean, what is the point of this life if that is all that it has in store for us? And then, of course, there was the fourth sight, which was the wandering monk. And that gave him hope that there was a way to see contentment and happiness in this human life. And that was when he went forth and ultimately became enlightened. So this image, spiritual image of ourselves, in a way being on fire, reminds me of how the Buddha must have felt when he realized the depth of the basic human predicament as symbolized by old age, sickness, and death. So in a way, the image of fire, from a worldly perspective or from a mind perspective, can give us insights into what is being said, but also raise questions. So all of us here, because nobody will be in a Buddhist center without having had some idea of the fourth sight, or having had some idea of the basic human predicament of old age, sickness, death. They might not be live for you, but think back to why you came to the Buddhist center the very first time. There would have been something indicative of the human predicament that brought you along. What was that for you? What were your equivalents of the first three sights? And secondly, all of you here must have had some kind of voice of an elder outside the house calling you, or some sort of sense of a fourth sight, a wandering mendicant. Well, there are not many wandering mendicants, there are wandering order members here. So you would have had some sight of a wandering order member. Was that what, did that spur you on to further action? Did that voice, did that give you an answer to the question that you came here with in the first place? So these things are for each of us to reflect upon. But just taking the image of the burning house, we can see that it gets quite deep through a process of reflection. It gets quite deep and gets quite personal. And in a way, that's the point. It raises issues and it raises questions, and it may even raise challenges. And that's fine. That's what it's for. It's for us to recognize that and then rise to those challenges, turn away, whatever the decision we make. But we're doing it with clarity. Does this make sense to people? It's a different, as I say, it's very much a different voice of the Buddha than stage 4 of the Eightfold Path is, right, whatever it might be. And we'll talk about that for the next half hour. It's a different voice. It's a voice that's talking in a way to the depths and bypassing our intellect. Why we came along to the Buddha Center in the very first place was because of a realization of something not quite right about the human condition. We were searching, there was a search. What was that about? What was the voice that we heard What was it that we experienced once we had taken those steps, and what have they done to us since? So then we might want to look at the mansion, why the mansion was described as being decaying. Why wasn't it beautiful? Well, again, it harks back for me to the central point that this is an enlightened mind talking to my unenlightened mind. Well, I can't make any assumptions for you. I can say quite confidently for me, an unenlightened mind. And an unenlightened mind, from the point of view of an enlightened mind, would be somewhat dilapidated. It would be somewhat shabby. It would be somewhat unattractive. Because an unenlightened mind has an unenlightened world. So in this level, it's kind of this one and the same thing, the world and the mind. It's conditioned. And there are three marks of all things that are conditioned from the point of view of the unconditioned or the point of view of the enlightened. And those three marks are that it's impermanent, unsatisfactory, and insubstantial. But we tend not to see that. We tend not to see impermanence. We have had, to some degree, we have seen, otherwise we wouldn't be here, we have seen, we've glimpsed unsatisfactoriness. Nearly everybody that comes along to a Buddhist centre has at least glimpsed unsatisfactoriness of life. That's almost invariably why we're here. We've glimpsed that. And in a way, this is just the enlightened mind saying to us, exactly, things are unsatisfactory, they are impermanent, and they are insubstantial. So in a way, you could say that the mansion being so shabby and dilapidated is a reflection of the marks of conditioned existence. That's why it's not a shiny marble-clad Marbella beachside villa. But there may be things that come up for you about why the mansion was dilapidated, which are different from that. These are just suggestions, suggested ways to kind of delve more deeply into the symbols. And then, of course, we've got the ghosts and the evil spirits and the nooks and crannies of the dilapidated mansion. What might they represent? Well, at one level, we could say that, I don't know if this is true or not, but I'm perfectly open to the possibility the scriptures are full of celestial beings being around in the universe and the Buddha talking quite happily with them and conversing with them. Perhaps there are, through time immemorial, we've talked of ghosts and leprechauns and trolls and different things in cultures. By trolls, I mean the Nordic ones, not the online ones. Since time immemorial, these things have been part of our culture. Who knows, maybe they exist. I don't know. I'm not saying they do, but from an enlightened point of view, maybe they're more open to the world, to the universe being inhabited by more than just us. I'm open to that possibility. On a more mundane level, looking at ourselves and our minds, perhaps the ghosts represent all of our old habits, that get us into trouble that we want to try and get rid of. Perhaps that's why we came along here to learn to meditate. Our habits, our tendencies, our opinions, and our views are very, very deep and often unhelpful or even unskillful. And our views can hold us back. Perhaps the ghosts and the evil spirits that are still inhabiting the dilapidated house represent, for example, our views that are unhelpful but keep haunting us. Perhaps even the ghosts represent our karma, or karma vipaka, technically, the consequences of our previous unskillful behaviours, which from a Buddhist perspective will affect us into the future. They will affect our mental states. Hence our emphasis on leading life as ethically as possible, because ethical purity saves us, as it were, from the effects of karma vipaka. Perhaps the ghosts and the evil spirits represent our karma that haunts us through our life. So I hope that's it's a bit later than I thought. I hope that's helped to kind of lay out the kind of broad parable and help you to try and sort of see a way in to what some of these symbols might represent for you. So for the last few minutes, and then at the end, hopefully we'll have time to come together and we can just have an open session for any questions that might have come up for anybody. But for the next 10 minutes or so, I'd like us just to get into groups of maybe 3 or 4 or whatever kind of works out organically. And you can feel free to just talk about anything that may have come up for you through this. But if you haven't had anything specifically coming up for you, there are some questions I've got that you can try and discuss. So one question would be, does the voice that you've heard, as I say, you must have heard something to be here in this room, does the voice that you've heard evoke any sense of urgency for you? So we have the symbol of fire and escape and danger, and the voice of the elder. So the voice of the elder that you've heard into whatever little whisper or whatever quietly, does it evoke any sense of urgency? Or do you just think, oh man, I'll go do it next week, next month, when I feel like it? Is there a sense of urgency for you? Another question to perhaps consider is, do you see yourself as a decaying mansion? Or do you see yourself as the Marbella villa? Which do you see yourself as? And the last question, which you may or may not get to, but an interesting one. It might actually, this is a question, I wasn't sure about this one, but anyway, it started. This may stray into somebody else's talk, but these themes will come up. You know, they will overlap these talks. So I'm saying it anyway. So the last question is, what would have enticed you out? What would have got you out of the burning house? So there we are. So as I say, groups of 3 or 4, whatever works organically. And so we've only got a few minutes, couple of minutes left before it's time to go home. So just an opportunity if there were any burning comments or questions or anything from anyone. Anything you'd like to share? Anything you're not sure about?
We're sort of confused about, well, in a way, the children have been very, very naughty by not
Yeah.
coming out of the house.
Yeah.
But then they do come out of the house and then they're rewarded. That was maybe they got the best gifts they could possibly get. So that was, I guess, a point of confusion in the parable.
Ah, yes. No, that's a very good question. It will be unpacked and explored later. I think that aspect of the gift.
After enlightenment, yeah.
But in a way, it raises the question, not to stray too far into what somebody else will probably do much better. It's really about, for the spiritual life. I mean, in a way, we are all naughty anyway, because we're playing about when we know that we shouldn't. So it is speaking to us. And it's really about the question, if you want to follow the spiritual life, and most people at the start of the spiritual life are petrified about what they might have to give up. They don't want to give up toys. So the toys, in a way, represent our attachments to life as it is. And the only way that these toys can be prized out of us or off of us is with the promise of something better. So in a way, the main kind of early hurdle in life, spiritual life, is having the confidence to give something up, because giving it up is for your overall good, and therefore you will be better afterwards. So that's kind of the territory that we're in. But it's interesting, yeah, it's I can see how you can get to they're being rewarded for being naughty. In a way, we're all naughty. It's a kind of kind way, as it were, to move us forward, as the kind of nugget, as it were. Good question. Yeah. No, everybody else perfectly happy. That's what I like. So it's now 9:30. So time to draw this to a close. So thank you very much for coming, everyone. Hope as many of you as possible can come back next week. Alan's mum and dad have a safe journey home. And next week, I think it's after Siddur next week, we'll be unpacking more symbols from this so-called simple parable. So do come back for the next exciting installment. Thank you. Thank you.